أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. Friends, ladies, gentlemen, conferees, please have a seat. We're very happy to have with us today a colleague from one of our partner centers from Beijing, China, from the Carnegie Center in China, which is partnered with Tsinghua University in Beijing, which is one of the more renowned universities in China. We're very happy to have with us Dr. Matthew Furchin. Matt is spending a few days in Lebanon. He had meetings with officials and others in Beirut, and he flies back today to Turkey and back to Beijing. Matt works at the center in Beijing and teaches at Tsinghua University. He works on issues related to the Chinese economic model, the informal economy of China and Chinese Latin American relations in general. He got his PhD from Cornell University in the US and an MA from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. In cooperation between our center and the center in Beijing, we asked Matt to, and he was interested in coming to visit Beirut and visit the center here, and we asked him to share with us some of his views about the current Chinese economic situation, economic experience, lessons learned from there, and concluding with possible lessons learned for countries in the Middle East. We might also ask him about Chinese-Middle East economic relations and possibly even political relations, although he really works more in economics than on politics. This session is being broadcast also by internet, so there might be people following us in that way. It's also being videotaped to be edited and placed on our website for people to also follow it later on video by website. The presentation will be in English, but we have translation into Arabic and from Arabic into English, so feel free to listen in or ask questions in either Arabic or English. Matt, we're very, very happy to have you with us here in Beirut. It's been a pleasure having you here, and we very much look forward to your comments. I've asked Matt to speak for about 30 minutes. Usually we ask for a bit shorter, but this is a topic that is maybe certainly new to many of us, so we'd like to hear from you for a good period and then enter into a discussion with our guests here today. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for coming today. I just want to say a few words of thanks in general to the center here in Beirut, and especially to you, Paul, and to the staff for setting up my trip. Yesterday I had a wonderful conversation with the interns here that really was a great start to my time here in Beirut and at the Carnegie Center. So I'm thankful to everyone here. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is China's state-economy relations and how this is interpreted outside and inside of China and what it means for the rest of the world. This topic itself is something that I've been working on for around a decade at least as part of my own dissertation topic. And I also have a new paper that I believe is in the handouts that you have here, an academic paper on the topic of the China model and the Beijing consensus. So I'll be basing the talk partly on that paper. So for those of you who are interested in some of the details of that argument, please feel free to take a look at that paper. The other sort of immediate background and inspiration for coming here and talking about this is both Paul and Yazid Saeed visited Beijing last year and gave great presentations that were very inspirational in helping me to sort of think about the situation in China and China's interaction with this part of the world. And so I'm very excited to have the opportunity to come here and visit and talk about some of these issues related to China. The disclaimer here is just that I'm actually not an economist, but I will be talking about what are issues that are heavily debated by economists, but not just economists. So I'll be bringing a political angle to this as well. Again, the topic today is understanding the China model or the Beijing consensus and what that means for China and for the rest of the world. So what I'm going to do is divide up the talk into first a discussion of debates outside of China about how we should best understand the relationship between the state and the economy in China, and then take a look at similar debates as they take place within China itself, and then talk at the end about sort of what all of this discussion and disagreement means for China and for its relations with the rest of the world. So to sort of preview my main argument, I want to argue that there is no China model, and in fact there is no consensus in terms of a Beijing consensus or otherwise about how China got to where it is today, or even where it should go. And I mean this at both an international level and a domestic level. And so what I want to do today is shed a little bit of light on how it's maybe more important to instead understand the debates, what the debates are about, again, outside and inside of China, and what they mean in a sort of in a more practical policy sense. I'm often asked the question as well, so is there really a China model? So I want to kind of move beyond that to say that it's the debates about the China model that really matter, and I think we can learn something about that. And more specifically, I think discussions outside of China about what China is or isn't often reflect more about very local issues. And so I say here that even international politics, when it's discussing China, is really local. And in terms of China, it's really an issue of debate about what stability is going to mean for China domestically and internationally. This is the sort of focus of debates. What does stability mean? What should it mean? What are the challenges to stability to China, both at home and abroad? I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I want to spend just a minute talking about some historical issues. What I want to say about this is that debate and contention about what China is or isn't, the direction, its path, this is something that has been going on for a long time, since at the very least the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. There's been intense discussion both within China and outside of China, debate and a lot of political and economic fighting about what China is or isn't. This goes way back. There may have only been a period of maybe 5 years at the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China in which there was some general agreement about the direction that the country should go. This was quickly upended with Mao's Great Leap Forward, which then led fairly quickly thereafterward to the Cultural Revolution. So we see these major upheavals in China, and much of it was about, in essence, what direction the country should go, what should be the proper relationship between the government and the economy. This continues in a less dramatic form after 1978, but since 1978 there have been episodes of disagreement, continuous disagreement that sometimes flares up and comes out into the open more clearly. This is maybe most obvious in the case of 1989. But the point I'd like to make with this is that from the outset, there has been major disagreement within China and outside of China about the direction that the country should go and what China means for the rest of the world. And I say this because I think in recent times, especially this year, there has been a lot of discussion, especially in the Western media, about an all of a sudden breakout of ideological contention within China. I think this is completely misplaced. There's never been agreement. And we shouldn't expect there to be. So again, it's important to understand the lines of disagreement. So let me start with the different portrayals of this state-economy relationship, what we often hear of now as the China model, outside of China. And what I mean by outside of China is basically discussions in English, largely in the media, in academia, and in policy circles. And much of this takes place in publications that are published in the United States and Europe. And a couple of prominent ones that sort of set the groundwork for a positive portrayal of China. What I have listed here as the idea that China will rule the world because of its positive model. This comes from a couple of writings in particular. Joshua Cooper Ramo, who wrote an article in 2004 called The Beijing Consensus, and then a more recent book by Martin Jacques called When China Rules the World, kind of captures the essence of this idea that China is doing something right. What is it that China gets right in this view? First of all, they point to China's very rapid economic growth of average of around 10% since 1978 or so, and the idea that China has done this on its own terms, has not followed Western prescriptions for economic development, but has instead followed its own path. Included in this kind of a positive portrayal of a China model is the idea that China has a very old and unique civilization, that it has grafted the best ideas from around the world onto some of those Chinese traditions, and that in terms of foreign policy, China offers an attractive alternative to others, especially American foreign policy, because China is more multilateral in its approach, respects sovereignty, and is very interested in the development concerns of the emerging economies and other developing countries in the world. Finally, I think that this portrayal of China as offering a positive alternative, of there being a Beijing Consensus or a China model to contend with some version of Western hegemony, has gotten traction, especially since the financial crisis. Because of a seeming downturn in the West and a continuing of the Chinese developmental machine that has not been affected all too negatively by the downturn in the West. So in this portrayal, the West, including the United States and Europe, has got something fundamentally wrong. China seems to be doing something fundamentally right. This view is counteracted very strongly by those who say that China will absolutely not rule the world, that China's developmental success in large part comes from the following of rather orthodox Western economic policies, including the opening of trade in the late 1970s, the opening of the agricultural sector in the 1980s, the reduction in the number of people working in state-owned enterprises. So basically, the downsizing of the Chinese state and the embrace of markets at both a domestic and international level. So they say it's not that China offers some sort of effective state capitalism, but instead has its economic growth is in large part due to the embrace of markets. Others, however, point out that to the extent that China does have elements of state capitalism, that it is an illiberal form of state capitalism. They point out that China is both a threat to itself and potentially to others in the world, because it offers a mixture of a closed political system and a relatively open economic system. And they think that this is very harmful, again, to both China and to others who may be willing to follow this model or think that they can or should follow this model. Those who argue that China is state capitalist and therefore potentially a harm to itself or to others often see the imminent demise of this model and say it will reach its limits, just as have other versions of state capitalism wherever you might look. That could be Japan, it could be Korea, could be elsewhere. Let me now turn to the domestic Chinese version of this discussion. Before I do that, let me just say that I think these portrayals outside of China of what China is make it somewhat complicated for China, for the Chinese government, because the image of China and what this relationship is not completely in China's own hands. Much of it is outside of the control of the Chinese government, of Chinese scholars, of whoever. But within China, this idea of what China's model has been, how it has gotten to where it is today, is also very much contested. And I'll go through three different views within China of what China is and where it should go. The first of these is a sort of official party portrayal of what China should be doing and how it's gotten to where it is. The Communist Party likes to emphasize that as opposed to the period under Mao, since 1978, the country has just been practical. It is non-ideological, and it has not sought to embrace political contention as a driver of economic and or political development. So it's a kind of pragmatic view of how China has gotten to where it is today. What is it that the party stands for? It clearly wants to be seen as promoting development and at the core stability. And this means stability at home and abroad. The interpretation of what stability means, I'll get to in just a minute. I think it is very much up for grabs in China today, again, both at home and abroad. But you see the catchphrases, harmonious China, harmonious world, frequently in China's diplomacy and also in domestic policy. So the idea at the heart of this is that what China wants, what it seeks, at the end of the day, is stability, harmony for itself and in its relations with the rest of the world. What is it that China is against? It is against the sort of extreme neoliberal policies and values as espoused by the United States and as implemented in places, say, like Latin America in particular. The official media in China often portrays these sort of neoliberal policies as fundamentally leading to chaos and crisis in the countries that have adopted them. So China sees itself as representing something that is the opposite of neoliberalism. And at the international level, China is very much in favor of multilateral solutions, respect of sovereignty, and again, this is juxtaposed against an American view of, or an American history of unilateral interaction and disrespect for sovereignty. Now, there are two main groups in China beneath the sort of official government or party level that have diametrically opposed views of where China is today and where it should be going. There's a group called the New Left. They're the New Left because it is not acceptable to be the Old Left. The Old Left is basically not for reform of any kind. The New Left is generally accepting of the reforms that have come after 1978. However, they feel that the government needs to do more to create equality, to reverse trends of increasing inequality, to protect the interests of labor, especially urban labor, and also peasants in the countryside. So there's a feeling that the state can and should continue to play a positive role, especially the central government and the Communist Party should have a very large role in correcting problems that are out there in society and in the economy. And in this sense, there is a fundamental concern or worry about the role that markets play. Markets are seen as inherently disorderly by the New Left, and therefore it is the state which needs to provide order or stability for them. So any source of instability domestically is tied to markets that are not controlled or governed better by the government. And finally, there is a strain of thinking within the New Left that says that China has a unique path toward modernity, that it should not embrace universal values, Western values, liberalism at a political level in particular. And this often lends itself to strains of nationalism, saying that China should reject impositions from the West, in particular from the United States, telling China how to run its economy and how to run its political system. Now, opposed to this view is a group that categorizes themselves as liberals, sometimes even neoliberals. China is the only place where I've been where people will willingly call themselves neoliberals. Generally speaking, this is a bad word, but in China there are quite a few who willingly embrace this term, although with the caveat that they say a kind of classic liberalism. In this view, the state is the source of many of China's problems. It is the source of inequality. It is the source of unfairness. It is the source of inefficiency. Therefore, the primary problem that China confronts is reducing the role of the state, reducing the role of state monopolies, reducing the role of arbitrary state power, which they think leads to problems of corruption, problems of inequality, some of the same problems that the peasants or people who have lost their jobs in state-owned factories face. They argue that there needs to be increased liberalization across the board in China, in almost any area that you can think of. So financial markets, increase property markets. In many different areas, the feeling is China needs to continue along with the reform process that it began in 1978 and that people fear has stalled since then. In addition, there is a strain of thinking within this because of the emphasis on order and stability. Everyone needs to have an argument about where this comes from. In terms of this liberal argument, it tends to be that markets are inherently, naturally ordering. And so Friedrich Hayek, of all people, who's a great critic of socialist planning, is actually very popular in China and is taught as almost a matter of course in many economics departments across the country. This idea that Hayek had, that markets might be naturally ordering and that you don't need the state to come in and impose a kind of order are popular among liberal thinkers in China. And finally, those who argue along these lines, along the liberal lines, embrace the idea of universal values, think that China has something to learn from other countries, both in an economic and in a political sense, close to arguing that there should be eventually a political pluralization in China. But for now, many say, let's start with the economic process, let's start with reining in the arbitrary control of the government, and once we have matured to a certain state, then we can think about the adoption of a more plural political system. But for now, there's a bit of hesitation along that because it's not practical to fully argue that. You won't be allowed really to engage in this debate if you take that too far. Okay, so that's the general framework for these debates outside and inside of China. And so I hope that with that brief overview, you at least have the sense that there is no consensus, either outside or inside of China, about where things should go. However, as I emphasized in the discussions within China, there is a great deal of concern, all parties, from the level of the government to the Communist Party to these intellectual and policy debates. Everyone has to have something to say about stability. And so I want to talk just briefly about what some of the challenges to stability are, both at home and abroad for China. When I was thinking through this list, I could have gone on for many, many pages about this, and I think that Chinese scholars, economists in particular, would be very willing to sit down with people and tell them how big this list actually is. So let me just go through a few key issues. The first is that China, at the highest levels of the leadership, has declared that it wants to change the development model. No matter what we think of how China got to where it is today, there is broad agreement that China needs to change its development trajectory. So included in that is the idea that China needs to move from an economy that is somewhat dependent on foreign markets to purchase China's exports. China wants to increase domestic demand so as to not be as reliant on those foreign exports. There's a recent push to change the financial system, to internationalize the currency, to potentially open to liberalize the trading band for the currency, to allow for freer trade of the currency, to movement of the currency in and out of the country, and to put more resources into the hands of consumers generally, to allow for more innovation, more entrepreneurship, to allow for credit to be more readily available for those who are outside of the state sector. This is a fundamental shift. This is basically saying we have gotten to this point doing a certain set of things. We are now going to change gear. So this is embedded in the new 5-year plan that China has, and is a very hot topic of discussion in China today. And there's a leadership transition happening this year, so something that we will be paying attention to is the extent to which these priorities continue to be put up front by the new leadership as well. The challenge of maintaining a growing economy and doing so within a system in which there are increasing expectations from the citizens. This is going to be a very, very difficult challenge for China to deal with. So with economic expansion, basic needs have been met in many ways, and so people are increasingly demanding better environment, better social policies in terms of education and health care. And there is just a growing diversity of social and political and economic interests in the country. And this is something that the government and the party is going to have to deal with. And expectations are high. When you have growth at this high a level for this long, the expectation is that things will continue to move quickly and for the foreseeable future. And this challenge will be difficult, especially given the idea of the need to fully transition the economy. Some other additional very big challenges that I won't go into detail now, but I'd be happy to discuss later. A looming demographic shift in which China will be aging rapidly. This is both sort of natural as China has urbanized, but is also due in part to the one-child policy. So that policy has been effective, so effective potentially that there is now the problem of these single-child families that are going to have to care for aging parents and grandparents, and a social system that is not yet prepared to deal with that. Massive environmental challenges, educational challenges, especially with migrants who've come to the cities, and inequality, which is large and is often connected to concerns about corruption. And we see this in the scandal earlier this year with the political leader, Bo Xilai, who was accused of using his position to get public funds out of the country, but also had all of this wealth, and it's kind of been exposed in a large way, and people are talking about this. At the international level, this same concern about stability is important, and I would encourage all of you to, when you hear about China's policy in a given area, to think about how it fits with your own conception of what may be a stabilizing or a destabilizing action on the part of China. I have here balancing impact and responsibility. Is China too liberal? What I mean is China's actual impact in the world is growing rapidly. Its economic impact in particular is, in the last decade, has dramatically increased in places, especially resource-rich parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America. So all of a sudden, China becomes one of the main trade partners and major sources of foreign direct investment for countries that 10 years ago had almost no interaction with China. There is, I think, a bit of a slower response in terms of thinking about what the political and geostrategic policies should be that follow from this economic influence. And so I worry a little that China's foreign policy is too liberal. So as opposed to those who think of China as being a sort of state capitalist country, I worry that China's firms lead the country into difficult situations, which are somewhat unexpected in certain parts of the government. So its firms may make a deal in a certain part of the world. If something goes wrong with that, then the government has to come in and think, okay, well, how did we get into this situation, and now what are we going to do about it? We can talk about maybe what that means in the case of Libya. I think we can also look at the case of Myanmar, and I think Venezuela may be something to keep your eye on for the future in this instance. I think there may be a fundamental mismatch in the way that China thinks about stability and what it may mean to others in other parts of the world. So, Paul, when you came last year and gave a very interesting discussion about events in the Arab Spring and in Libya in particular, you mentioned that there may be the possibility that change may be necessary for stability in certain circumstances. This is something that is very difficult to deal with in the Chinese context, and especially when looking at examples, I think, from the Arab Spring. So for China, this kind of change, this sort of increased number of voices and a pluralization of political parties clearly represents something that is a bit discomforting and is almost by its very nature destabilizing. This is not necessarily how it's perceived in other countries. So what China thinks is stable at both a domestic and an international level may not be what others think it is. Lastly, in terms of these international challenges, China is working very hard to increase its soft power. Dmitry Trenin, who's the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, was asked to say something about this when he visited Beijing, and I thought it was a great answer. You know, what do you think of China's soft power? He's like, I don't know what soft power is exactly, but for me, it's how much you like yourself. And I think that's a very interesting point given China's concerns about soft power. It all begins at home. What is it that China thinks about itself? So in the context of what I was just saying about debates within China, there's a lot of disagreement about how China got where it is, what's good and bad about the society, about the economy, about politics today. There's a lot of disagreement about what the country should be about, what path it should take. And it's very difficult to project onto others what those principles are and what others should like about you if there's no fundamental disagreement about what that is. There's agreement about harmony, about peace, about multilateralism. But when it comes down to making difficult decisions in the real world, in a world in which China's having an increasing impact, those concepts fall short, I think, of the expectations that many have of China. So this is something to look at. What is it about China? What does China like about itself? And then how may it project that onto the world? Okay, I will close with a few comments on the China model and lessons for the Middle East and North Africa. In my comments on what many outside observers say about China, again, the idea of state capitalism looms large. And many say that the illiberal threat that China poses is to those who would like to maintain a closed political system but have a very successful economic system. So I'll talk a little bit about that here. Before I get to that, I think though that appeal is largely overblown, and I certainly don't think that this is a policy. There is no official embrace of the idea of the China model or the Beijing consensus, and there's certainly no official embrace of state capitalism as being what China is and what is good for the rest of the world. But I'll come back to that in just a minute. In terms of potential positive lessons that might be learned from China, one of them is a commitment to development. And this is surprisingly not present in many countries throughout history. So this is something China seems to have gotten right, and you don't have to go very far in conversations with anyone in China about the importance of development as a national goal. And this has been the case since the beginning of the People's Republic, but in a very different way since 1978. And so this is the idea that the country is about promoting development is front and center, and this can potentially be a lesson. More specifically, China has a positive recent track record of developing infrastructure domestically, but also increasingly internationally. So the state-guided investment, in particular for infrastructure development, is something that many argue China has done well and is also able to do well abroad. So one possible lesson is looking at the way in which China has effectively built up its own infrastructure and potentially partnering with China to do infrastructure development. This is something that the Chinese government has prioritized in its going out strategy, and it provides a lot of incentives for its own firms to go out and do this kind of thing. The other side of this, however, is concerns that some of China's own investment in infrastructure has been misspent and maybe the quality of the actual infrastructure is subpar. But generally speaking, this appears to be something that China has done relatively well. Experimentation and flexibility. I think it's clear that China has experimented with all kinds of different policies at the local level. When those are seen as being effective, then they're transferred to a larger level. And China has been relatively flexible, I think, over the last 30-plus years in adapting ideas from others. These are generally not specific prescriptions. So I think that all in all, it's difficult to say that China has very specific, a specific model that can be followed really by anyone anywhere. And I'll say a few things about why I think that is. China's starting point from being a socialist planned economy from the 1950s through the 1970s is not the same starting point that all other countries have. China's sheer size in terms of geographic size, but also population size, which means a variety of things, access to all kinds of different markets, and at the same time a population that was largely in the countryside, underemployed, and then moved to the cities and is continuing to move to the cities. This is basically impossible to replicate. While the economic growth is appealing, I think the closed political model is not, and especially in the context of the Arab Spring. If it's about a pluralization, if it's about different voices and increased role for those who did not have a say in the political and social outcomes of the society, well, China doesn't have much to offer along those lines, and that's why I say that China at an official level is not going around saying, yes, we have this great authoritarian system that you should also adopt. And they don't say, well, that's how we got to where we are. For our domestic circumstances, the party leadership will say, we have to have a strong hand in maintaining order and stability and promoting development. That's how we did it. That was our specific circumstances. It's not for everyone. But I also think there's just limited appeal for this. I know we can talk about this in the case of those who have said they might be willing to or would like to follow a China model in which there's this mix of authoritarian government and liberal market economy. I'd be happy to talk about that. Finally, in my discussion about where China wants to go in terms of transforming its economic model, if China was state capitalist, it is actively trying to move away from that. The Prime Minister has said the country needs to reform the financial system to basically allow for finance and credit to be freed up and to be provided to those who are not in state-owned enterprises and not otherwise connected to the state. So, in other words, those who might be starting their own companies. There is a desire to reduce the size and the role of state-owned enterprises. because there's a feeling that they are not being as efficient as they could and not necessarily creating the kinds of companies or products and innovation that China is prioritizing. So if China was state capitalist, it is now officially trying to move away from it. And one of the key issues here is there is a fear of falling into a middle income trap, that if China stops now with reforms, if state-owned enterprises become too powerful, if the financial system isn't transformed, then China is going to stagnate, and then all kinds of problems will follow from this. So China itself is trying to transform its model. And this is the real challenge that it faces, and this will affect not only China, but all of those with whom it increasingly interacts. So that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much for a very well-structured and very informative presentation. Thank you for that, and thank you for coming to visit us in Beirut, and I thank the audience for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.